Thank you very much, Chair, for being in here today on this debate, or it's not even a debate, it's a discussion really. First, I want to state for the record for anyone listening to or watching this debate who has survived sexual assault, rape or any sort of violence that I believe you. I know that you are there and I know your pain and I believe you and you did nothing wrong. You survived, and however you chose to handle the moments, hours, days, weeks and months after, you did your best. And I stand with you, and I know that I'm not the only member of the House who feels the same. I take time to make that declaration last Cahill because I fear sometimes in our haste to make substantive policy and legislative contributions on difficult topics, we can forget that at its core it's about the people who have been through one of the single most traumatic and life-altering experiences that one can. I welcome in the main the report from the Justice Committee on how we help survivors of sexual violence speak their truth and gain justice, because God knows we have a very poor reputation in that regard. It has to change, and this report is welcome, and I feel that it needs to lead to urgent action. I'd like to make some points speaking directly to the recommendations. There were 14 main recommendations in the report, and I'm just going to speak to 4 of them. Recommendation number 3 calls for the availability of specialist training and guidelines for practice regarding the questioning of vulnerable witnesses is rolled out as soon as possible for members of the legal profession. While I think the intention is good here, I would agree with many of the witnesses to the committee that the availability isn't good enough. Mandatory training for all staff in the legal profession would surely be the best solution, not just for victims of sexual violence, but all vulnerable people. And I am keenly aware that there are many vulnerable people who will make their way through the court system, and seeing as this week we mark the first ever Adult Safeguarding Day in Ireland, I think this is a point worth noting. Recommendation number 7 calls to ensure that separate legal representation to support victims of sexual assault is provided through the entire trial process as appropriate, but particularly when questioned about their sexual history during cross-examination. This, I think, coupled with training for barristers on how to safely cross-examine victims is of paramount importance. I'm quoting from chapter 2 of the report, where a victim said, "I think overall I was probably in the stand for, give or take, 4 hours. I can't tell you how horrific it is being cross-examined. To this day, I can hear that barrister's voice in my ear crystal clear." One of the truly grotesque aspects of the prosecution of sexual violence offences is the allowance and circumstances of a discussion about a victim's sexual history. And while I appreciate the report points out that there is a high bar for that to be permitted, I posit that there should be no bar. A victim's sexual history is not pertinent to case because sexual violence is not about sex or sexual preference or anything close to it. It is about power, control and abuse. And I'm sure we will all remember the case which drew media attention a few years ago for the introduction of a victim's underwear as part of the defence's argument. That is about shaming and victim blaming, simple as, and it should have no place in a justice system which takes a victim-centred approach, which this report calls for. Recommendation 9 wants to ensure that a rollout of a scheme for the training and accreditation of intermediaries progresses as quickly as possible. And I want to ask if maybe the Chair, you might have an update on that. As the report was published in June, so I hope that there has been some progress on that issue since then, and these are an essential part of the plan to make the proceedings more manageable for victims. Recommendations 11 and 12 make 2 suggestions which I think must be discussed together. Firstly, it states that consent must be incorporated within the new RC curriculum at both primary and secondary, and that programmes of consent are rolled out at 3rd level as a matter of urgency. And I obviously completely agree with this, having been involved in rolling out of consent in 3rd level, but it's all well and good to suggest that we have to roll it out, but the resources need to be made available and the staffing needs to be made available. And I know I spoke to some staff in higher education institutions who said they wanted to get it right, but they didn't have the time and the resources. And secondly, in recommendation 12, we see the committee report acknowledge the prevalence of sexual violence within the LGBT community, in particular the high levels of sexual violence experienced by those who identify as being transgender or non-binary. And I very much welcome this inclusion in the report. I would, however, point out that if we want to use school settings as a place to have those important early conversations about consent, and we know there is a high level of violence experienced by members of the LGBTQ+ community, then we have to surely ask, is it right that for this and for many other reasons, is it acceptable that the majority of schools in Ireland with Catholic ethos refuse to teach sexual education in an inclusive way? We need to chill all children of all identities and all orientations, whether they know it at that age or not, to know that their body is worthy of respect, care and that their consent matters. And that is true for gay, lesbian, bi, trans and intersex kids as it is for anyone else. The time has long since passed for the exclusion of LGBTQI+ people from teachings on sex ed, relationships and social teachings in schools. Chair, you might give me some patience with what I'm going to say next, as it's deeply personal and it's not easy to say out loud. We've spoken a lot about stats and figures in here, and behind every stat and figure is a person, and I'm just one of many, many people behind those stats. I did what I was supposed to do. I went to the Garda station and I reported it. I sat in a room for hours with no food or water until I could go to a SATU clinic, and I was literally scraped on the inside for evidence. To this very day, that was the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to my body, and I will feel those scraping sensations for as long as I live. I gave my testimony in the station, but I knew that I was not going to be able to continue with this process. Even though I knew what had happened to me was wrong, I also knew that this case was going to go nowhere. I was already shattered by trying to piece together what happened just for that one testimony. I would not, I could not, and I would not do it again. I had no faith in either our legal system or how society would view me to even try and pursue it any further. I went home and I continued my life as best I could, and I am not alone in that decision that I made. We need to do more than just push legislative change. We must challenge the societal belief that it is the victim's fault. We must accept that without a yes, it is a no, end of. And I would suggest that a bigger problem than a complete lack of faith in our legal system, and other people have spoken about that lack of faith, and Senator Rowan said, I don't know if I could encourage my daughters to go and report, and I would agree with that, having been through that process. I think the bigger problem is the fact that society has ingrained into its victims, into me, into other people who have suffered, that we have done something to have caused our own rape. This is a much bigger challenge facing us. To finish up, to all the people affected by this legislation or who have ever had to give testimony or have been unable to do so, I believe you. I cannot guarantee you that everyone you deal with in the future will. I cannot guarantee that you will even get justice, and if anything, the statistics tell us that you have a 95% chance of not seeing your abuser convicted. I hope that this report results in real change. I hope that it gives victims confidence that they can give their testimony safely, with honesty and without fear of the incredible difficulty that they will have to go through, and it is a long and difficult road that they have ahead of them. We in the Labour Party want to see this change, we want to see this legislative change, we want to see a societal change, and we want to see a culture change. In the meantime, all I can say is I believe you, and I'm sorry that you've been let down by us all, but I believe you.